Chapter 6 Vance Offers an Opinion. Saturday, June 15, 2 p.m. We sat for a while smoking in silence, Vance gazing lazily out into Madison Square, Markham frowning deeply at the faded oil portrait of old Peter Stuyvesant that hung over the fireplace. Presently Vance turned and contemplated the district attorney with a faintly sardonic smile. "I say, Markham," he drawled, "it has always been a source of amazement to me how easily you investigators of crime are misled by what you call clues. You find a footprint, or a parked automobile, or a monogrammed handkerchief, and then you dash off on a wild chase with your eternal ex signum. Upon my word, it's as if you chaps were all under the spell of shilling shockers. Won't you ever learn that crimes can't be solved by deductions based merely on material clues and circumstantial evidence?" I think Markham was as much surprised as I at this sudden criticism. Yet we both knew Vance well enough to realize that, despite his placid and almost flippant tone, there was a serious purpose behind his words. "Would you advocate ignoring all the tangible evidence of a crime?" asked Markham, a bit patronizingly. "Most emphatically," Vance declared calmly. "It's not only worthless but dangerous. The great trouble with you chaps, do you see, is that you approach every crime with a fixed and unshakable assumption that the criminal is either half-witted or a colossal bungler. I say, has it never by chance occurred to you that if a detective could see a clue, the criminal would also have seen it, and would either have concealed it or disguised it, if he had not wanted it found? And crime these days is, ipso facto, clever enough to manufacture whatever clues suit his purpose. Your detective seems wholly unwilling to admit that the surface appearance of a crime may be deliberately deceptive, or that the clues may have been planted for the definite purpose of misleading him. I'm afraid," Markham pointed out, with an air of indulgent irony, "that we'd convict very few criminals if we were to ignore all indicatory evidence, cogent circumstances, and irresistible inferences. As a rule, you know, crimes are not witnessed by outsiders." "That's your fundamental error, don't you know?" Vance observed impassively. "Every crime is witnessed by outsiders, just as is every work of art. The fact that no one sees the criminal or the artist actually at work is wholly inconsequential. The modern investigator of crime would doubtless refuse to believe that Rubens painted the Descent from the Cross in the cathedral at Antwerp if there was sufficient circumstantial evidence to indicate that he had been away on diplomatic business, for instance, at the time it was painted. And yet, my dear fellow, such a conclusion would be preposterous, even if the inferences to the contrary were so irresistible as to be legally overpowering. The picture itself would prove conclusively that Rubens did paint it. Why? For the simple reason, do you see, that no one but Rubens could have painted it. It bears the indelible imprint of his personality and genius, and his alone. I'm not an aesthetician," Markham reminded him. "I'm merely a practical lawyer, and when it comes to determining the authorship of a crime, I prefer tangible evidence to metaphysical hypotheses." "Your preference, my dear fellow," Vance returned blandly, "will inevitably involve you in all manner of embarrassing errors." He slowly lit another cigarette, and blew a wreath of smoke toward the ceiling. "Consider, for example, your conclusions in the present murder case," he went on in his emotionless drawl. "You are laboring under the grave misconception that you know the person who probably killed the unspeakable Benson. You admitted as much to the major, and you told him you had nearly enough evidence to ask for an indictment. No doubt you do possess a number of what the learned Solons of today regard as convincing clues. But the truth is, don't you know, you haven't your eye on the guilty person at all. You're about to bedevil some poor girl who had nothing whatever to do with the crime." Markham swung about sharply. "So," he retorted, "I'm about to bedevil an innocent person, eh? Since my assistants and I are the only ones who happen to know what evidence we hold against her. Perhaps you will explain by what occult process you acquired your knowledge of this person's innocence." "It's quite simple, you know," Vance replied, with a quizzical twitch of the lips. "You haven't your eye on the murderer for the reason that the person who committed this particular crime was sufficiently shrewd and perspicacious to see to it that no evidence which you or the police were likely to find would even remotely indicate his guilt." He had spoken with the easy assurance of one who enunciates an obvious fact. a fact which permits of no argument. Markham gave a disdainful laugh. No lawbreaker, he asserted oracularly, is shrewd enough to see all contingencies. Even the most trivial event has so many intimately related and serrated points of contact with other events which precede it and follow. That is a known fact that every criminal, however long and careful he may plan, leaves some loose ends to his preparations, which in the end betrays him. A known fact? Vance repeated. No, my dear fellow. Merely a conventional superstition, based on the childish idea of an implacable, avenging nemesis. I can see how this esoteric notion of the inevitability of divine punishment would appeal to the popular imagination. Like fortune-telling and Ouija boards, don't you know? But my word, it desolates me to think that you, old chap, would give credence to such mystical moonshine. Don't let it spoil your entire day, said Markham acridly. Regard the unsolved or successful crimes that are taking place every day, Vance continued, disregarding the other's irony. Crimes which completely baffle the best detectives in the business, what? The fact is, the only crimes that are ever solved are those planned by stupid people. That's why, whenever a man of even moderate sagacity decides to commit a crime, he accomplishes it with but little difficulty, and fortified with the positive assurance of his immunity to discovery. Undetected crimes, scornfully submitted Markham, result, in the main, from official bad luck, not from superior criminal cleverness. Bad luck, Vance's voice was almost dulcet, is merely a defensive and self-consoling synonym for inefficiency. A man with ingenuity and brains is not harassed by bad luck. No, Markham, old dear. Unsolved crimes are simply crimes which have been intelligently planned and executed. And do you see, it happens that the Benson murder falls into that category. Therefore, when, after a few hours' investigation, you say you're pretty sure who committed it, you must pardon me if I take issue with you. He paused and took a few meditative puffs on his cigarette. The factitious and casuistic methods of deduction you chaps pursue are apt to lead almost anywhere. In proof of which assertion I point triumphantly to the unfortunate young lady whose liberty you are now plotting to take away. Markham, who had been hiding his resentment behind a smile of tolerant contempt, now turned on Vance and fairly glowered. It so happens, and I'm speaking ex cathedra, he proclaimed defiantly, that I come pretty near having the goods on your unfortunate young lady. Vance was unmoved. And yet, you know, he observed dryly, no woman could possibly have done it. I could see that Markham was furious. When he spoke, he almost spluttered. A woman couldn't have done it, eh? No matter what the evidence? Quite so, Vance rejoined placidly. Not if she swore to it and produced a tome of what you scions of the law term, rather pompously, incontrovertible evidence. Ah, there was no mistaking the sarcasm of Markham's tone. I'm to understand that you even regard confessions as valueless? Yes, my dear Justinian, the other responded, with an air of complacency. I would have you understand precisely that. Indeed, they are worse than valueless. They are downright misleading. The fact that occasionally they may prove to be correct, like women's preposterously overrated intuition, renders them just so much more unreliable. Markham grunted disdainfully. Why should any person confess something to his detriment unless he felt that the truth had been found out, or was likely to be found out? Upon my word, Markham, you astound me. Permit me to murmur, privatissime e gratis, into your innocent ear that there are many other presumable motives for confessing. A confession may be the result of fear, or duress, or expediency, or mother-love, or chivalry, or what the psychoanalysts call the inferiority complex, or delusions, or a mistaken sense of duty, or a perverted egotism, or sheer vanity, or any other of 100 causes. Confessions are the most treacherous and unreliable of all forms of evidence, and even the silly and unscientific law repudiates them in murder cases unless substantiated by other evidence. You are eloquent. You wring me, said Markham. But if the law threw out all confessions and ignored all material clues, as you appear to advise, then society might as well close down all its courts and scrap all its jails. A typical non sequitur of legal logic, Vance replied. And how would you convict the guilty, may I ask? There is one infallible method of determining human guilt and responsibility, Vance explained. But as yet the police are as blissfully unaware of its possibilities as they are ignorant of its operations. The truth can be learned only by an analysis of the psychological factors of a crime, and an application of them to the individual. The only real clues are psychological, not material. Your truly profound art expert, for instance, does not judge and authenticate pictures by an inspection of the underpainting and a chemical analysis of the pigments, but by studying the creative personality revealed in the picture's conception and execution. He asks himself, does this work of art embody the qualities of form and technique and mental attitude that made up the genius, namely, the personality of Rubens, or Michelangelo, or Veronese, or Titian, or Tintoretto, or whoever may be the artist to whom the work has been tentatively credited? My mind is, I fear, Markham confessed, still sufficiently primitive to be impressed by vulgar facts, and in the present instance, unfortunately for your most original and artistic analogy, I possess quite an array of such facts, all of which indicate that a certain young woman is the, shall we say, creator of the criminal opus entitled The Murder of Alvin Benson. Vance shrugged his shoulders almost imperceptibly. Would you mind telling me, in confidence, of course, what these facts are? Certainly not, Markham acceded. Imprimis, the lady was in the house at the time the shot was fired. Vance affected incredulity. Eh, my word! She was actually there? Most extraordinary. The evidence of her presence is unassailable, pursued Markham. As you know, the gloves she wore at dinner, and the handbag she carried with her, were both found on the mantel in Benson's living room. Oh, murmured Vance, with a faintly deprecating smile. It was not the lady, then, but her gloves and bag which were present. A minute and unimportant distinction, no doubt, from the legal point of view. Still, he added, I deplored the inability of my layman's untutored mind to accept the two conditions as identical. My trousers are at the dry cleaner's, therefore I am at the dry cleaner's, what? Markham turned on him with considerable warmth. Does it mean nothing in the way of evidence, even to your layman's mind, that a woman's intimate and necessary articles, which she has carried throughout the evening, are found in her escort's quarters the following morning? In admitting that it does not, Vance acknowledged quietly, I no doubt expose a legal perception lamentably inefficient. But since the lady certainly wouldn't have carried these particular objects during the afternoon, and since she couldn't have called at the house that evening during Benson's absence without the housekeeper knowing it, how, may one ask, did these articles happen to be there the next morning if she herself did not take them there late that night? Upon my word, I haven't the slightest notion, Vance rejoined. The lady herself could doubtless appease your curiosity. But there are any number of possible explanations, you know. Our departed Chesterfield might have brought them home in his coat pocket. Women are eternally handing men all manner of gewgaws and bundles to carry for 'em, with the cooing request, "Can you put this in your pocket for me?" Then again, there is the possibility that the real murderer secured them in some way, and placed them on the mantel deliberately to mislead the polizzi. Women, don't you know, never put their belongings in such neat, out-of-the-way places as mantels and hat racks. They invariably throw them down on your favorite chair or your center table. And I suppose, Markham interjected, Benson also brought the lady's cigarette butts home in his pocket? Stranger things have happened, returned Vance equably, though I shan't accuse him of it in this instance. The cigarette butts may, you know, be evidence of a previous conversation. Even your despised Heath, Markham informed him, had sufficient intelligence to ascertain from the housekeeper that she sweeps out the grate every morning. Vance sighed admiringly. You're so thorough, aren't you? But I say, that can't be by chance your only evidence against the lady? By no means, Markham assured him. But, despite your superior distrust, it's good corroboratory evidence nevertheless. I dare say, Vance agreed, seeing with what frequency innocent persons are condemned in our courts. But tell me more. Markham proceeded with an air of quiet self-assurance. My man learned, first, that Benson dined alone with this woman at the Marseilles, a little bohemian restaurant in West 40th Street. Secondly, they had quarreled. And thirdly, they had departed at midnight, entering a taxicab together. Now, the murder was committed at 12:30, but since the lady lives on Riverside Drive in the 80s, Benson couldn't possibly have accompanied her home, which obviously he would have done had he not taken her to his own house and returned by the time the shot was fired. But we have further proof pointing to her being at Benson's. My man learned, at the woman's apartment house, that actually she did not get home until shortly after 1. Moreover, she was without her gloves and handbag, and had to be let in to her rooms with a passkey, because, as she explained, she had lost hers. As you remember, we found the key in her bag. And, to clinch the whole matter, the smoked cigarettes in the grate corresponded to the one you found in her case. Markham paused to relight his cigar. So much for that particular evening, he resumed. As soon as I learned the woman's identity this morning, I put 2 more men to work on her private life. Just as I was leaving the office this noon, the men phoned in their reports. They had learned that the woman has a fiancé, a chap named Leacock, who was a captain in the army, and who would be likely to own just such a gun as Benson was killed with. Furthermore, this Captain Leacock lunched with the woman the day of the murder and also called on her at her apartment the morning after. Markham leaned slightly forward, and his next words were emphasized by the tapping of his fingers on the arm of the chair. As you see, we have the motive, the opportunity, and the means. Perhaps you will tell me now that I possess no incriminating evidence. My dear Markham, Vance affirmed calmly, you haven't brought out a single point which could not easily be explained away by any bright schoolboy. He shook his head lugubriously. And on such evidence people are deprived of their life and liberty. Upon my word, you alarm me. I tremble for my personal safety. Markham was nettled. Would you be so good as to point out, from your drizzy pinnacle of sapience, the errors in my reasoning? As far as I can see, returned Vance evenly, your particularization concerning the lady is innocent of reasoning. You've simply taken several unaffined acts and jumped to a false conclusion. I happen to know the conclusion is false because all the psychological indications of the crime contradict it. That is to say, the only real evidence in the case points unmistakably in another direction. He made a gesture of emphasis, and his tone assumed an unwonted gravity. And if you arrest any woman for killing Alvin Benson, you will simply be adding another crime, a crime of deliberate and unpardonable stupidity, to the one already committed. And between shooting a bounder like Benson and ruining an innocent woman's reputation, I'm inclining to regard the latter as the more reprehensible. I could see a flash of resentment leap into Markham's eyes, but he did not take offense. Remember, these 2 men were close friends, and, for all their divergency of nature, they understood and respected each other. Their frankness, severe and even mordant at times, was, indeed, a result of that respect. There was a moment's silence. Then Markham forced a smile. You fill me with misgivings, he averred mockingly. But, despite the lightness of his tone, I felt that he was half in earnest. However, I hadn't exactly planned to arrest the lady just yet. You reveal commendable restraint, Vance complimented him. But I'm sure you've already arranged to ballyrag the lady and perhaps trick her into 1 or 2 of those contradictions so dear to every lawyer's heart. Just as if any nervous or high-strung person could help indulging in apparent contradictions while being cross-questioned as a suspect in a crime they had nothing to do with. To put him on the grill, a more accurate designation. So reminiscent of burning people at the stake, what? Well, I'm most certainly going to question her, replied Markham firmly, glancing at his watch. And one of my men is escorting her to the office in half an hour. So I must break up this most delightful and edifying chat. You really expect to learn something incriminating by interrogating her? Asked Vance. You know, I'd jolly well like to witness your humiliation. But I presume your heckling of suspects is a part of the legal arcana. Markham had risen and turned toward the door. But at Vance's words he paused and appeared to deliberate. I can't see any particular objection to your being present, he said, if you really care to come. I think he had an idea that the humiliation of which the other had spoken would prove to be Vance's own. And soon we were in the taxicab headed for the criminal courts building.